Hello. Welcome to the library. I think that you will recognize most, if not all, the titles that I take you through today. But I think there is a pretty good chance that you may not have read these books. Several of them have been turned into films. Several of them have been turned into several films because, of course, they are all very old stories. So there has been quite a lot of time to adapt them multiple times. So I think you're going to be curious now as to what I'm talking about. Well, when I tell you the first title, I think that you will have a much better understanding of the theme of today's library. So, the first book we're going to talk about is Dracula. Now, you're probably thinking, why Dracula? Everybody knows Dracula. There's not a person alive who doesn't know about vampires. And Bram Stoker is, up until recently, one of the most famous vampire stories ever told, until a certain book overtook that genre a few years ago. So this is a very important piece of classic Gothic horror, though, and I think it's a great place to start if we're going to talk about that genre. This is written by Bram Stoker. He is Irish, and Bram is short for Abraham, in case you're wondering. And though it certainly didn't invent the idea of the vampire, because vampires have existed in many cultures for hundreds, if not thousands of years. I say vampires have existed, I mean the myth of the vampire has existed. That's all that I can say with any authority, but perhaps they do exist. Either way, Bram Stoker's Dracula defined the notion of the vampire in its current form. So, as a humanoid creature, not a scary, fanged monster. Bram Stoker's Dracula is attractive, seductive, looks human, and is ageless and pale because, dead but undead. And he sleeps in a coffin. So there are a lot of vampire conventions that we take for granted these days, and which perhaps modern writers of vampires take for granted, but which really came about through Bram Stoker. So I read this for my university degree, and I read it in broad daylight in the middle of an Australian summer on my couch with all the windows open in humid heat, with a breeze blowing through, and I was completely creeped out. So that's, really saying something, I think. And so, anyone who thinks that the classics can't affect us anymore, and who thinks that old stories don't really speak to how we really feel now, should definitely read this and be otherwise persuaded. So let's talk a little bit about what happens in Dracula. So this was written and set in 1897, so that should help to put into some context some of the things that happen. and I will go into some of the implications of this time period. But first, a brief primer on what actually unfolds in this plot without too many spoilers. So, straight from the blurb, Jonathan Harker leaves England to visit his client, Count Dracula, in his Transylvanian castle. There, he learns of Dracula's dreadful secret and is imprisoned while the Count heads for England, where he intends to prey on the vulnerable and the good, including Jonathan Harker's spirited fiancée, Mina Murray. He does manage to escape, no spoilers, but this happens quite early on in the story, and goes back to England, only sort of just gets back to England with his life. And this is where the real story sort of begins, because then a bunch of really weird stuff happens, and Dracula, the book, turns out to be very much a, at the time, modern technological mystery romp. So Jonathan enlists his friend Van Helsing, whose name I'm sure you recognize. Van Helsing has some experience in these sorts of matters. So together, Mina and Van Helsing and Jonathan and a couple of their other friends embark on this journey of discovery and detection to, I guess, unveil what Dracula is and what he plans to do. So it's, in that sense, you can probably tell that it sounds a lot like a modern sort of fantasy, sci-fi kind of horror story. And but it perhaps all sounds kind of quaint. There's a lot of talk in this book about using the phonograph, the telegraph, and that all sounds very quaint now, but when you think about it in the context of 1897, you realize that this was all very cutting-edge, high-tech stuff at the time, high technology. They were making use of the most outlandish and yet real developments in communications technology at the time. So this is not at all unlike us these days watching, CSI or something or Bones. Bones is probably a really good example of that, where to conduct their detective work they have to use these sort of ridiculously high technology, futuristic pieces of equipment and software, like touch screens that hover in the air in front of you, and databases of the sorts of things that we couldn't possibly have a database of, or that are wildly specific ways of communicating with each other that don't currently exist, that sort of thing. So for the 1897 reader, this would have all been very exciting and futuristic almost, or at least very much on the vanguard of what was becoming available. You definitely need to get acquainted with the grandfather of all vampire stories. So Bram Stoker's Dracula, I'm going to recommend that to you. My next recommendation for you is much in the same vein, in that you are almost certain to have heard of it, and I think there is a very good chance that you may have seen some sort of film adaptation of this story. But unlike Dracula, it hasn't spawned numerous adaptations of the creature within it or the concepts within it, possibly because it is a story which says more about the monstrosity of human nature than anything else. And we don't really want to replicate that as a concept too often. So, the next book is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Frankenstein was published in 1818 and written when its author Mary Shelley was only 18 years of age. This is one of the greatest stories of all time in the Western canon, and I think it's quite fair to say, Mary Shelley invented science fiction. So people tend to think of science fiction as very much a boys' genre, a man's genre. It is quite often preoccupied with space travel and technological advancement and a lot of like laser guns being shot into the depth of space and, cyborgs and cyberspace and that sort of thing. It was invented by a woman, this marriage of science and fantasy. Frankenstein, as you probably know, is actually the name of the scientist who invents the monster in this book. So the creature itself in Frankenstein doesn't actually have a name. It is referred to either as the creature or the monster. And Frankenstein is just I was going to say mad scientist, but he's not a mad scientist. He's just a person curious, a very, very flawed, almost Greek, tragic character, really, who can do nothing right. Basically, he creates a sort of human out of parts, miscellaneous parts, and he runs a current through it, and I think maybe some amazing electrical storm happens or something that boosts the effect of this, and long story short, the creature is given life. And far from being proud and happy at his creation, Frankenstein is horrified, and he beholds this monstrosity that he has given life to and that he is responsible for, and he flees. He's not at all interested in taking responsibility for his creation. I mean, Victor Frankenstein is the ultimate deadbeat dad of literature. He goes to great lengths to make this person exist, if you can call him a person, and then he abandons him for not being as beautiful or as was expected, as ideal. Ultimately he could have changed a lot of things and could have prevented a lot of things if only he would stand up to and take responsibility for what he did and what he created. But I mean, he has got to be the most hateable character in all of literature. I mean, you talk about villains who are evil, Voldemort. All of the classic villains are kind of outwardly evil, and they are evil in that they seek to cause harm. Well, the horror in Frankenstein is that Frankenstein himself is just a big coward, and that causes a lot of suffering. This is awful. This is horrific. I mean, can you imagine being given life and then having to face daily the fact that you will be forever alone because of what you are? So Frankenstein is very much one of these Greek tragedies, hamartia and hubris are abundant. Frankenstein, the man, is appalling as a human, and his monster has the opportunity to be kind and good, but is thwarted by never receiving any love or care or attention. And so, the gothic horror in this story could be the monstrosity of the monster. It could be the familiar common gothic trope of like sublime landscape, because much of it takes place in the Swiss Alps, which adds that kind of pathetic fallacy to everything. But the horror in this story is very much that of human nature, and I think that you should definitely check this one out and be open to meditating a little on human nature and beauty and acceptance and prejudice and cowardice. So nothing too complicated, some light reading. So I will add this one to your list. The next story that I have for you is one that perhaps you may not have heard of. It is a classic, but it has not been so successful in permeating pop culture and modern culture. So, it is The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. So this is a very, very old story. It was published in 1764, and it is generally regarded as the first Gothic novel ever written. It came to define the genre. So the story takes place in the Castle of Otranto, and it begins when the lord of the castle, Manfred, is about to marry his son, Conrad, to the princess Isabella. Conrad is a very sickly person himself, and Princess Isabella does not really want to marry him. And then something very strange happens. A huge, enormous helmet falls on Conrad and kills him. Now, this would be strange enough in itself, but it's particularly ominous because of an ancient prophecy which foretold something sort of similar, or something which you could potentially extrapolate to apply to this having happened. And it kind of sends Manfred a little bit crazy. And so Isabella tries to escape, and then she runs across a peasant called Theodore who tries to help her escape, and that's where it all gets very complicated. There's armies involved, there are ghosts, there's villainous lords, but it's somewhat Shakespearean in the sense that not everything is as it seems, and not every person is who they seem to be. So it is, of course, a spooky story. It does take place in a medieval castle, and there is certainly the sense that there is danger lurking behind every corner or over every page, and anything could really happen. So it is a really important read, I think, if you are interested in ghosts and the Gothic, and if you are interested in really the beginnings of when we started to tell spooky tales in this way. So, I hope you have enjoyed your visit to the library today. Now you have 3 classic Gothic horror stories to try, and you can get an idea of where some of our favourite spooky stories and ideas and tropes come from. So let me know how you go with your reading, and in the meantime, I look forward to seeing you at the library soon. Bye bye now.